As we come closer to what will hopefully be the end of COVID-19's reign of terror, I think it's important to take a moment and speculate about where this could lead us. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these are just speculations, and while they are based on data, both current and past, they are just at the very most hypotheses that can be disproven. But I do believe they are important to think about. Here in America, COVID has claimed the lives of over 500,000 people, and will, unfortunately, claim the lives of more before we are finally free from it. And before we look forward to any potential outcomes from all of this, it's important to take a look back and understand how we got here. Looking back. For the United States, it starts in 2005. While on vacation in Crawford, Texas, Republican President George W. Bush read John M. Barry's book, The Great Influenza. It was about the Spanish flu of 1918. The information in this book, combined with the SARS outbreak in 2003 that killed over 700 people, made the president realize that America needed to be ready should a pandemic ever reach its shores. There's a video on C-SPAN that I'll post a link in the video description where Bush gives a speech about the necessity of preparing for a pandemic. Now, it is a 30-minute C-SPAN video, so you may need a fresh mug before watching it. Bush's plan to prepare America for a pandemic came with a price tag of about $7.1 billion. Sadly, other politicians couldn't see the value in spending that much to create and maintain a program for a threat few believed could happen. So the plan was only given less than half the required funding and fell apart. Compare that to the $5 trillion America is now spending to recover from the pandemic, and it becomes a modern testament to that proverb about an ounce of prevention. Later, Bush's successor, Democratic President Barack Obama, agreed with the Republican leader's assessment that America needed to be ready for a potential outbreak, and also understood that it would be tough to convince a lot of politicians to spend money on a program that would prepare them for something they believed was unlikely to happen. So he gathered experts to draft the Playbook for Early Response to High-Consequence Emerging Infectious Disease Threats and Biological Incidents, simply referred to as the Pandemic Playbook. It was a 69-page manual that would be America's go-to in the event that a viral outbreak ever occurred within the states. After Obama left office, Republican President Donald Trump eventually threw Obama's playbook out the window. There was no reason given for this, it was just largely believed he did it to undermine the achievements of a rival political party. But in doing so, undermined the efforts of leaders from both political parties in their attempts to prepare America for a viral outbreak. Then there is also a collection of people who just didn't believe the political leaders, and when America's leadership finally accepted the reality of COVID-19, that group of people rejected the safety precautions set down by our nation's leadership and further accelerated the spread of the virus. So the three major reasons that over 500,000 Americans have died from this pandemic are political stinginess, small-minded political pettiness, or just straight-up ignorance in the populace. I can only imagine that in other nations severely impacted by COVID-19, one or more of these scenarios similarly played out to produce such a catastrophe. And it's important that these scenarios do not repeat themselves, because looking forward, we may not be able to afford it. Looking forward. From my perspective, there are three avenues of thinking for us to explore when looking to life after COVID-19. The first avenue is the most pleasant, and is the one we're all hoping for, so let's take a look at that first before we head down the others. The first avenue is simply the Hollywood comic book ending, where the status quo is restored, life goes back to normal. If major pandemics happen only once every century, then COVID-19 is it, the big bad, and once the virus is eradicated, it's just a downhill ride back to normalcy, or at least what resembles it. Here in the United States, our status quo needs some improvement, but at least we can get back to improving it rather than worrying that our case of the sniffles could kill our family. And this is what we're all hoping for. No more wearing masks in public. We can start going out more often, going to concerts and events again. We return to the way things used to be, for better or for worse, hopefully wiser for it. There will probably be and should be some kind of memorial to honor the doctors and nurses who died trying to keep people safe during the pandemic. It will be important to remind us of what happens if we let our guard down in the face of a viral outbreak, especially when we start speculating about what can happen next. Our second avenue of thinking is less pleasant, but important to consider. This path spouts from the other major viruses that have come out in the past couple of decades, from SARS in 2003, swine flu in 2009, and bird flu in 2013, now COVID in 2020. We have to take a moment to consider that as bad as things have gotten, this all could have been worse, and this all could just be a warning shot for something worse looming on the horizon. And anywhere from 3 to 10 years from now, we could be dealing with something even more deadly than COVID-19. We have to take a moment to consider that our struggle with COVID-19 is not a war, but just one battle in an ever-escalating war, and the horrors that it has inflicted upon us are just a warning as to what happens if we do not escalate our response to meet the threat. We may take a moment to ask, where are these viruses coming from? And some people will probably shout out one particular country in general. But to be honest, I think it goes deeper than that. In my opinion, and again, this is just my opinion, I think a lot of it has to do with climate change. There's a lot of information about how changes to the climate are affecting the forest and oceanic life, but not a lot, at least to the layman, about how it's affecting viral and bacterial life. And the reason viruses seem to stem from this area could be to the fact that it's also one of the most polluted places on Earth. Personally, I've subscribed to the theory that the sicker we make Earth, the sicker Earth makes us. Now, I'll be the first to admit it's just a theory and I could be wrong, but if the theory turns out to be true, then climate change could be having an even worse impact than we realize, and we may be in store for worse viruses than COVID in the near future. At the same time, this second avenue isn't as bad as I may be painting it to be, mainly because it is within our power to prevent. As we saw earlier, the main reasons COVID is having such a devastating impact on our lives is due to a failure in either leadership or the people refusing to follow their leaders in the face of a deadly pandemic. And if enough people learn from this, I know some won't and others will simply refuse to, but if enough people have learned, especially those in power, then we can reduce the impact of any future viruses that emerge. Sadly, the only way we can tell how deadly a virus can be is after it has left a body count, but with the right people doing the right things, that number can be kept to a minimum. That's why this second avenue may not be so bad, as it is within our powers as human beings to prevent, as long as we remember the lessons we have learned, paid for in the lives we have lost, to ensure it never gets this bad again. The third avenue, however, is arguably our worst case scenario. This avenue stems from the information we have of the variants of COVID-19 that have sprung up all over, and the original virus itself is seeing resurgences in many places across the globe. If this continues, our battle with COVID could be going on for quite some time. Why this avenue of thinking is what I believe to be a worst-case scenario is because it leads us to think that COVID-19 becomes a new baseline. It becomes the new flu or common cold, only with a much higher mortality rate, and our struggle with it can go on for quite some time. However, as the World Health Organization states on their COVID-19 website, that vaccines can be modified to match the variants of the virus. But in a worst-case scenario, we have to contemplate that the virus may be able to adapt faster than we can adjust and mass distribute vaccines, especially if you consider that different versions of the virus emerge from various geographic locations. Attempting to mass produce and mass distribute different vaccines for what could be over a dozen different versions of COVID may prove overwhelming. Especially consider that as of the recording of this, several countries are running short on or still do not have access to the original vaccine, increasing the probability that more variants may emerge within these countries. So these are the three avenues of thought that I believe are worth taking into consideration as we get closer to what we all hope will be the end of COVID-19. What it boils down to, well, for me anyway, is summarized in it by a quote from H.G. Wells. In his cornerstone science fiction work, The War of the Worlds, a story about aliens trying to invade Earth only to get decimated by all the viruses and bacteria that humans are naturally immune to, he writes, "By the toll of 1 billion deaths, man has bought his birthright of the Earth." It's about how many human beings have just died trying to survive on this planet to make it ours. But if COVID-19 is just a sign of what's to come in our future, or if it continues to linger and our struggle with it becomes a near perpetual conflict, then our birthright of the Earth is something we may have to start fighting a lot harder to keep. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and stay safe out there.